Nicaragua, where he proposed to pillage and devastate as many towns and villages as possible. His reputation as a successful commander was now so high that he had no trouble in getting men, for more offered themselves than he could possibly take. He departed with 700 men and 6 ships, stopping on the way near the coast of Cuba, and robbing some poor fishermen of their boats, which he would need in shallow water. Their voyage was a very long one, and they were beset by calms, and instead of reaching Nicaragua, they drifted into the Gulf of Honduras. Here they found themselves nearly out of provisions, and were obliged to land and scour the country to find something to eat. Leaving their ships, they began to land march through the unfortunate region where they now found themselves. They robbed Indians, they robbed villages, they devastated little towns, taking everything that they cared for, and burning what they did not want, and treating the people they captured with viler cruelties than any in which the Buccaneers had yet indulged. Their great object was to take everything they could find, and then try to make the people confess where other things were hidden. Men and women were hacked to pieces with swords. It was Lolonois's pleasure, when a poor victim had nothing to tell, to tear out his tongue with his own hands, and it is said that on some occasions his fury was so great that he would cut out the heart of a man and bite at it with his great teeth. No more dreadful miseries could be conceived than those inflicted upon the peaceful inhabitants of the country through which these wretches passed. They frequently met ambuscades of Spaniards, who endeavoured to stop their progress, but this was impossible. The pirates were too strong in number, and too savage in disposition to be resisted by ordinary Christians, and they kept on their wicked way. At last they reached a town called San Pedro, which was fairly well defended, having around it a great hedge of prickly thorns. But thorns cannot keep out pirates, and after a severe fight the citizens surrendered, on condition that they should have 2 hours' truce. This was given, and the time was occupied by the people in running away into the woods, and carrying off their valuables. But when the 2 hours had expired, Lolonois and his men entered the town, and instead of rummaging around to see what they could find, they followed the unfortunate people into the woods, for they well understood what they wanted when they asked for a truce, and robbed them of nearly everything they had taken away. But the capture of this town was not of much service to Lolonois, who did not find provisions enough to feed his men. Their supplies ran very low, and it was not long before they were in danger of starvation. Consequently, they made their way by the most direct course to the coast, where they hoped to be able to get something to eat. If they could find nothing else, they might at least catch fish. On their way, every rascal of them prepared himself a net, made out of the fibres of a certain plant, which grew in abundance in those regions, in order that he might catch himself a supper when he reached the sea. After a time, the Buccaneers got back to their fleet, and remained on the coast about 3 months, waiting for some expected Spanish ships, which they hoped to capture. They eventually met with one, and after a great deal of ordinary fighting and stratagem, they boarded and took her, but found her not a very valuable prize. Now Lolonois proposed to his men that they should sail for Guatemala, but he met with an unexpected obstacle. The Buccaneers who had enlisted under him had expected to make great fortunes in this expedition, but their high hopes had not been realized. They had had very little booty and very little food. They were hungry and disappointed, and wanted to go home, and the great majority of them declined to follow Lolonois any farther. But there were some who declared that they would rather die than go home to Tortuga as poor as when they left it, and so remained with Lolonois on the biggest ship of the fleet which he commanded. The smaller vessels now departed for Tortuga, and after some trouble Lolonois succeeded in getting his vessel out of the harbour where it had been anchored. and sailed for the islands of Delapertes. Here he had the misfortune to run his big vessel hopelessly aground. When they found it absolutely impossible to get their great vessel off the sandbanks, the pirates set to work to break her up and build a boat out of her planks. This was a serious undertaking, but it was all they could do. They could not swim away, and their ship was of no use to them as she was. But when they began to work they had no idea it would take so long to build a boat. It was several months before the unwieldy craft was finished, and they occupied part of the time in gardening, planting French beans, which came to maturity in 6 weeks, and gave them some fresh vegetables. They also had some stores and portable stoves on board their dismantled ship, and made bread from some wheat which was among their provisions, thus managing to live very well. L'Olonois was never intended by nature to be a boat builder, or anything else that was useful and honest, and when the boat was finished, it was discovered that it had been planned so badly that it would not hold them all. So all they could do was to draw lots, to see who should embark in her, for one half of them would have to stay until the others came back to release them. Of course, L'Olonois went away in the boat and reached the mouth of the Nicaragua River. There his party was attacked by some Spaniards and Indians, who killed more than half of them and prevented the others from landing. L'Olonois and the rest of his men got safely away, and they might now have sailed back to the island where they had left their comrades, for there was room enough for them all in the boat, but they did nothing of the sort, but went to the coast of Cartagena. The pirates left on the island were eventually taken off by a buccaneering vessel, but L'Olonois had now reached the end of the string by which the devil had allowed him to gambol on this earth for so long a time. On the shores where he had now landed he did not find prosperous villages, treasure houses, and peaceful inhabitants who could be robbed and tortured, but instead of these he came upon a community of Indians, who were called by the Spaniards bravos, or wild men. These people would never have anything to do with the whites. It was impossible to conquer them or to pacify them by kind treatment. They hated the white man and would have nothing to do with him. They had heard of L'Olonois and his buccaneers, and when they found this notorious pirate upon their shores, they were filled with a fury such as they had never felt for any others of his race. These bloody pirates had always conquered in their desperate fights because they were so reckless and so savage, but now they had fallen among thoroughbred savages, more cruel and more brutal and pitiless than themselves. Nearly all the buccaneers were killed, and L'Olonois was taken prisoner. His furious captors tore his living body apart piece by piece, and threw each fragment into the fire. And when the whole of this most inhuman of inhuman men had been entirely consumed, they scattered his ashes to the winds, so that not a trace should remain on earth of this monster. If in his infancy he had died of croup, the history of the human race would have lost some of its blackest pages. End of chapter 15.